And I'm going to start by just showing you kind of what PhoneGap 2 looks like. We released PhoneGap 2.1 on September 21st, which was ahead of schedule. And that's kind of awesome because that doesn't happen very often in software development. I'm going to talk about that. PhoneGap 2.2 is going to be coming out at the end of October. I'm running PhoneGap 2.0 only because I have a slightly older MacBook Air, and I'm absolutely terrified to update it to Mountain Lion right now because I've been on the road for the last couple weeks. But 2.1 and 2.2 are actually identical. It's just 2.1 has a lot more bug fixes for Mountain Lion and iOS 6. So this is the 2.0 download. Can you guys see that okay? Like in the back? Okay, cool. So it's just, maybe I'll open it in here. It's just a directory. There's nothing really special about it. And the PhoneGap package has a bunch of junk in it, like all of our documentation. So if you were so inclined, you can go to the docs. And if you're a Python guy, you could do like Python -m simple HTTP server. And that'll start serving them on port 8000. And you get all of our documentation, whatever. That's just kind of useful. So I'm not here to show you our docs, so I'm here to show you this stuff. So I'm going to get out of the docs, and I'm going to jump into lib. And if we look inside a lib, actually it's easier if I look at it in here. If I look inside a lib, you can see all the PhoneGap platforms that we support. Now, some of these you probably don't care about, like most of them. Why don't we take a look inside of iOS? Well, actually, let's get a sense of this. Who here has an iPhone? Jeez. Who has an Android phone? All right. All the same people. How many Blackberries do we have? Okay. Well, I'm Canadian, so that's why. Any Windows Phone users? Do you guys work for Microsoft? No? Okay. Windows Phone's actually rising up. So I'm going to jump into iOS. And we just created inside of PhoneGap all this new command line tooling capability. And the reason we did this, and you don't have to use the command line tools, by the way. There's visual tools as well. But we found our developers were all using command line tools, but they were all doing it in different ways. And so they were creating projects different ways. They were debugging projects different ways. They were logging different ways. And this is the PhoneGap project. You're not supposed to do that. So we wanted to have all the different nomenclature for how you interact with your project to be the same in PhoneGap 2. So one of the things you can do is create a project. And bin create is pretty simple. So we can go, let's see, create something on my desktop. I'm going to call it GOTO. I have to give it a package name, so I'll do IO, Brian, app, GOTO. And I'm going to give it a project name, GOTO app. And believe it or not, that just created an app on my desktop. So let's go take a look at my desktop. All of my devices, by the way, have the Courage Wolf as the background because he's awesome. So that generated this Xcode project. This is going to change a little bit from platform to platform, but the general gist of a PhoneGap application is that in the www folder is where you put your stuff, and then we generate all the other native bits. And so I'm going to kick that up. I think it's time for Adobe to buy me a new MacBook Air. There it goes. The long-running joke, if you've heard me present before, you probably heard it, but Xcode is exactly like Eclipse. It just looks like iTunes. It's true. So I've got this on iOS 5.1 still because I need maps while I'm in Europe. Build succeeded. Launches. And you get this little, so we used to have this horrible hello world. It was like this bad font and stuff. And so in PhoneGap 2, we finally have this kind of nice looking app that's really simple and clean. And it's got the little Cordova robot. So let's go take a look at the source code for him. Now, I opened an issue in our issue tracker at Apache Cordova, and I was like, we need a hello world app, and it needs to be really simple, which was, I guess, not specific enough about what simple is. So the markup for this application is really quite simple. You probably program web code, so there's nothing really special going on here. It's got an H1, it says Apache Cordova. We include some JavaScript for the Cordova bridge, and then we have this app initialized. So let's go take a look at that, because that's what's actually doing something. And this is pretty funny. I think this might be what happens when a Java guy writes JavaScript. So we have this global called app, and it calls a method called initialize, which in turn calls a method called bind, which in turn adds an event listener to device ready, which in turn calls app.report device ready. Like, what the fuck? Which then in turn changes a class name so that you get that little pulsing action on device ready. You can kind of see it right now. It's like pulsing ever so slightly. So you don't need to write that much code, but you can if you want to. So that was iOS. And were I to back out now and jump into Android land, bin create is exactly the same. So I can put this on my desktop, but I better not call it GoTo because it's going to generate an Android project, so I'll just call it GoTo and. And because it's Java, it's slow, and that's fine. So we'll jump over here. I'm going to kill Xcode, or else I'll regret leaving it running. And we'll kill you. And here's our Android project. And actually, is anyone doing Android dev here? All right, so this will look familiar. It's just like a classic Android project. We have one slight difference between iOS and Android, and then our Android implementation, we put our www folder inside of assets. The reason we do that is because we're lazy, and it's faster to load. That's about it. Otherwise, though, it's just a vanilla Android project. And so while I'm going to kick up the Android SDK manager, and I'm going to start an AVD, which is Android speak for Android Virtual Device. I'm going to start a 4.1. And I'm going to go get a beer while that boots. No, I'm just kidding. Although, why my computer decided to go sleep there, I don't know. So that's going to take a couple minutes. So we'll get back to that one because we don't want to. And now I can actually start my presentation. So I always feel like people, if I save that for the end, people are just like, "What's PhoneGap?" So I'd rather just start and show you, what PhoneGap is. But there's a lot more to it than that. So this is not me. That's Dave Matthews. But for some reason, it started circulating on the internet, tagged Brian LeRoux. It's not me. He actually lives in Vancouver too. So go figure. I've done some stuff. So that doesn't matter. I work for Adobe, but don't hold that against me. So PhoneGap lets you build native applications with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Has anyone here built a PhoneGap application? Oh, I'm at it. Holy shit, that's actually quite a few people. It's cool. Okay, so the idea of PhoneGap is that it's standards-based, and it's future-friendly. So we're not building applications to current standards. We're actually building PhoneGap applications to what we hope will be future standards. And it's open source software, so it's Apache licensed, which is great. And something we realized in the last year is that it's a really powerful extensibility layer. And so we didn't set out to build this thing this way. We actually just kind of made a mistake, and now people like it. So the extensibility layer is how PhoneGap talks to the native code side. And other people are using it. And of course, it's a huge community of software developers. I think our latest numbers that PhoneGap's been downloaded like 1.3 million times. So that's quite a bit. And we know that there's millions of apps now, but I can't say what they are. So PhoneGap is kind of an ecosystem. The first thing, Nitobi is the company I work for. When we created PhoneGap, we were acquired by Adobe just about a year ago. And at the time of the acquisition, we decided the best place for the source code to live was not at Adobe, but at the Apache Software Foundation. And so we donated the source code of PhoneGap back to Apache under the name Apache Cordova. Cordova was the street that Nitobi used to be on in Vancouver. So Adobe PhoneGap is a distribution of Apache Cordova. The way to think about this is Linux to Red Hat, or Chromium to Chrome, or WebKit to Safari. Same idea. Also, interestingly, and I didn't know this up until recently, but Apache distributes source, And the Eclipse Foundation tends to distribute binaries for whatever reason. So it sort of works out because we're an Apache project and we're shipping the source of PhoneGap or Cordova, and Adobe PhoneGap is like the binaries. So I'm going to talk about Cordova first. One thing you can notice that we've got this fancy URL, cordova.io, all the information about the project's there. This little robot dude is kind of our mascot. I guess that's Cordova. J. Chris, how's it going, man? So it's a mobile operating system compatibility and extensibility layer. That's a really complicated way of putting that we have plugins. So there's all these different platforms that we're targeting right now, and we're trying to give a common surface area or paint it over the same way. So you don't have to run all these different operating systems, all these different SDKs, and all these different emulators. Which, this one's to remind me that I booted the Android emulator at the beginning of this talk. You serious? If it didn't, it fucking hasn't loaded. Okay, that's the face of the mobile developer. Okay, so not only are we dealing with emulators, so there's all these different devices, and it's not just about phones anymore. When we started, maybe the name PhoneGap wasn't right. Maybe it was like supposed to be Device Gap or something, because there's tablets now, there's cars that are running Android, there's even desktop machines that are running Android and other things. Or the Windows Surface, Windows 8 Surface is now a tablet computer thing. Who knows? And another angle to all this too, so a lot of people are talking about responsive web design, and one thing has anyone tried this out yet? Is anyone using media queries in the audience at all? So this is pretty cool stuff, allows you to adapt your content for a layout, but there's a really big problem with responsive web design right now. In order for you to have a website react to different screen and handset sizes, you'll still have to download all of the CSS for all the possible combinations. So when you think about this, if you have a small handset on an edge network, you're still going to download all the assets for the larger form factor. But actually, there's frameworks to fix that. It's called South Street from Filament Group. I just like pointing that out because everyone right now seems to think that responsive web design is the answer, but it's really in its infancy. So another angle to all this is that we don't really know what the developers are going to do. If you ask anyone in the San Francisco Bay Area, everybody is on iPhone. But the market stats seem to indicate that everybody's actually on Android. And unfortunately, it's not even a good Android. It's Android 2.3, which is probably the new IE6. So all we do know is that there's going to be all these different platforms and that things are going to change. We haven't seen any consolidation yet. Another angle to all this, and I've been talking about this a fair bit because it's an interesting trend. So has anyone heard of Tizen? Like one person. Okay, two people. So Tizen is a collaboration between Samsung and Intel, primarily, and it's a Linux kernel sitting on top, and sitting on top of it is a WebKit, which is probably familiar to you if you remember WebOS from HP, which apparently is going to get open source later this year. Mozilla has a new project, and it's called Boot to Gecko. It's also called Firefox OS. I just saw demos of it last week, and it's looking amazing. And this is a Linux kernel with a web browser on top of it, so for this time it's Gecko. There's something called WebOS, which is a European Union initiative of some kind. It's underway, it's happening. There's also Chrome OS, and when you think about it, Windows 8 is also all about the web. So I don't know what this means necessarily, but it seems to me to indicate that this web thing might work out. So PhoneGap, who cares? Because that's the future. So PhoneGap today supports iOS, Android, BlackBerry, Windows Phone, Bada, which actually, so has anyone here ever seen a Bada phone? Nobody. Not. Oh, you have. Okay, well, yeah. So one person. Bada has more apps and developers and distribution than Windows Phone. And that's only because it has huge adoption in Korea, which is really interesting. Nobody has WebOS anymore. So that's today. This is what we support right now. But by this time next year, we're also going to have all these platforms in addition. Qt has actually been under development for a long time. Its future is a little bit sketchy. We'll see. But Windows Phone 8 is shipping. Windows 8 is shipping. Windows 7 we have an implementation. Firefox OS we have a shim, and Tizen we have a shim that's already working, which is kind of great. So you got this situation where there's all this different stuff going on. What should you do? Our general opinion in the PhoneGap team is that you should just build a web app. You probably shouldn't bother with building even a native application. Web solved operating systems a long time ago. It solved many screen sizes a long time ago, and it solved the SDK issues a long time ago. The only issue that remain right now is that the web is sandboxed. So, and this is for a good reason. It's not a bad thing that we have a security model for the web. It's probably why it's worked as well as it has. The web is a terrible offline story. If you've, I don't know, has anyone here seen Jake Archibald's App Cache is a Douchebag talk? I recommend it if you do. Haven't. It's funny as hell. So the app cache is supposed to be the solution to the web for offline, but essentially it just doesn't work. It's broken. Some people think that it's a detriment that the web doesn't have an app store. I actually think app stores are kind of a weird aberration. I don't know that they'll last forever, but this is personal opinion. I find Google to be much better for discoverability. The real issue for me is that the web can't access device APIs and that the tools just generally suck right now. Although the demo in the beginning, I think you kind of saw that, hey, actually, let's see, our Android emulator boot. Oh, it did. Sweet. Okay, so now we can build an Android app. So assets WW, this WW is like an old version of our app. So I'm just going to delete all that crap. I'm not going to delete this Cordova JS file. The JavaScript on our platforms is still a little bit different from platform to platform, and there's a really good reason for that, and I'm going to show it to you in a second. Okay, so we had our iOS app in the GoTo folder, and it's in www. So I'm going to select everything on this over-architected app and jump it into assets WW in our Android application. Back on the command line. In my, oh no. Okay, in my app, we have this command line tooling available for iOS, Android, all these platforms too. So not bin, Cordova, debug, and Cordova log. So this is going to barf a ton of output to my terminal because it's Java. No. What happened? It didn't like something. Apparently that package is bad. Don't mind me, wave my hands around. Just want to see if this works. No. Oh! That's stupid of me. Okay. So, let's regenerate that application. PhoneGap, Android. Oops, libandroid. Thanks, man. So bin create requires a path. We'll say desktop, go to better Android. io.brian, go to n. Takes a few seconds. Sweet. Get out of my face, Android SDK. It's kind of a screen real estate issue here, isn't there? Okay, so I'm going to take all the assets out of this other one that I generated that failed. Like just everything. Because it was only the Java bits that actually were an issue there. And I'm going to delete you and paste you. And I'm going to also delete this folder and pretend that never happened. Okay. Whoops. Is it better Android? Yeah. Cordova, debug. And if that is successful, Cordova log. Barf a bunch of output to my terminal. Yay. So that worked. There we go. Sadly, this is actually faster building to device, which kind of doesn't make any sense. You can get Intel. There we go. Go to Android. Really? Yay. Same source, whatever. It's a web browser. It's not really that surprising, is it? Okay. If you're doing actual Android development, by the way, you don't ever use the emulator. No one does. So PhoneGap's hybrid development, you kind of get the strengths of both the web and the native code. And you also get the same weaknesses, though. We're the first project to do this device APIs thing. So if you check out our APIs, they're all based on what we call device APIs. And when I joined Adobe, all of a sudden people started asking me about what they thought PhoneGap would be, because they thought now that Adobe was involved that it would change or something. So I've added this slide now to kind of make it very clear what PhoneGap is not. PhoneGap is not an IDE. We're not interested in building an IDE. I was totally kidding when I said you can use Dreamweaver, but you can if you want to. We don't dictate tooling choice. We're not a language. We're not going to build a higher level language that adds optional static typing and compiles to JavaScript, because other people are doing that. We're not proprietary. We're Apache licensed, and we're not a runtime. It's free open source software, and we want people to build what they want to build with it. We don't hide anything from you, and we don't try and abstract away the underlying platform tooling. We think that's a mistake. If you're going to build an iOS app, you still need to get into Xcode's internals. If you're going to build an Android app, you still need to have access to Android's tooling. So PhoneGap powered by Apache Cordova. This is that sort of bit I was saying earlier, where you have to think of us as a distribution of an open source project. We're actually not the only ones distributing PhoneGap. There's a whole bunch of different, or Apache Cordova, there's a whole bunch of projects out there doing this today. I think AppMobi would be the most notable one, but other people are embedding PhoneGap in their SDKs. SAP's doing it, Intel's doing it, IBM's doing it, Oracle's doing it. So PhoneGap is just a distribution. And sort of on that note, there's a whole bunch of corporate support for PhoneGap now. Ever since we joined the Apache Software Foundation, all these different organizations have jumped on board to support the project, which is great. Adobe's obviously got the most engineers. IBM has the second most engineers. I think Adobe, we've got roughly 12 full-time people, a total of 23 people on the project. IBM has 6 full-time people. Microsoft has 3. RIM has 6. Nokia has 2 guys that kind of fade in and out. And Google's got 3 full-time engineers on PhoneGap today. And they're working on both iOS and Android, which may interest you. And it's funny because Google joined and we're like, why? What are you guys doing? Can you fix Android for us, please? And they started working on iOS, which is weird. Web standards are really important. There's been kind of a lot of questioning about whether or not the standards process works. I think the kind of rapid adoption of HTML5 has shown that this thing can work. It's not always pretty, and the process possibly could be improved quite a bit. So anyways, we participate, but we participate as implementers. We're not really interested in the debate of editorship, but we are interested in seeing the web move forward as a platform. So we track a few different groups. The Device API Working Group is the primary one that we've been looking at. We implement most of the device APIs that they have standardized. So my computer right now is convinced that it's running on a mobile device, so I'm getting this mobile layout for our docs. But if you look, these are the kind of like things that I'm talking about for device APIs. And I'll go through those in a little more detail in a bit. We're also looking at like what's going on in kind of the other groups of the W3C. The widget group may be reformed in something called the packaging group, and there's another group called sysapps, which we're tracking. Sysapps has just been chartered. So with the device APIs, we basically went off and we created all these different awesome APIs for things like your camera or your contacts or your file system. And they left the security side of the story up to the implementers. And that's probably a bad idea. And now that we have all these different mobile operating systems and operating systems in general that are based on the web, it's becoming very apparent that we're going to need a runtime security model where we declare what permissions are needed for an application when we're building it. So the classic example is when you go to a Maps app, it's like, hey, can I use your geolocation? And you say yes. But you can't necessarily go back and find out what domains have access to your geolocation, revoke those rights later, or change those permissions. And when we start adding other APIs like your contacts and your camera, things can get pretty hairy. Your phone knows where you are, it knows what you look like, and it can email all your friends what's going on. So you don't want any of those things happening. I think we got like a different kind of philosophy for an open source project. So we started as a brute force implementation. We didn't try and do the right thing, which would be a compile to or something like that. We really believe in the web as the ultimate platform that we want to build against, and we actually don't even want to be doing this stuff. We really don't want to be writing Java and Objective-C. And we believe in open source. So this is where I'm going to show you guys a little bit of how we work. Has anyone heard of the term foreign function interface? It's kind of precious. It's basically what we do. It's an IPC call, or an inter-process communication call. We like to call it the hack. And the hack is different on different platforms. So this is why PhoneGap.exec, or why the Cordova source code has to be different on different platforms. So I'm gonna jump into my working development stream, and I'm going to look at our JavaScript. Is this the best tool for this? You can probably read this. So every platform in PhoneGap can share all the same JavaScript, but except for how our bridge works. And so I'll show you what I mean. In iOS, all PhoneGap platforms, this is a better way to describe this. So all PhoneGap platforms have a method called exec. And exec takes a few arguments. Let's see if I can find the method signature here. Right here, these are them. So it takes a success callback, a fail callback, a service, which would be something like com.phonegap.geolocation, an action, which would be something like watch current position or get current position, and then any arguments like enable high accuracy. So in each different platform, we have a different way of doing this. In iOS, we discovered a long time ago that it was impossible to communicate to native code unless you go through a URL. So we create an iframe, 0 pixels by 0 pixels, and we hide it. And then, I shit you not, and then down, somewhere, what is it, gap, oops. Yeah, right here. And then we just use the source of the URL to communicate back and forth between the native code and the JavaScript code. So now all of you good comp sci students are thinking this guy's nuts, and you're trying to look for a way out, but I'll watch you if you leave, and then I'll find you later. No, it's okay. It's hacky. We know this. And in fact, Apple knows this too. They have better methods in the pipeline for us at some point. You'd think this would be slow, but it's actually not. We have a benchmark that we run regularly. It gets around 400 operations a second. Now, 400 operations a second is not very fast if you're doing like a 3D game or something and you need to do like, I don't know, crazy math across this bridge. But we're using it for device APIs. So you do not need your geolocation 400 times a second. Probably once a second's good. So it's fast enough. So that's the iOS bridge. And if you thought that was weird, let's take a look at Android. So does anybody, this is not really the best indentation for the code because it's long method, but does anyone see anything weird in here? Actually, set number. Check out line 24. We override the prompt to communicate between the native code and the JavaScript code on Android, unbelievably. And it also works really fast. This is just what we have to do. So it's a crazy hack, and yes, we do use eval liberally. Don't believe Douglas Crockford, it's a useful method. Yeah, so that's how it works under the hood. And it's worked that way now for 4 years and consistently across many platforms. Now, I'm painting over some of the uglier details. In Android, we actually have something like 5 bridges that work different ways on different platforms. So different Android phones have different bridges that can possibly be faster. So we use like a strategy pattern. We pick the best bridge. But that prompt overload is easily the most heinous. So I wanted to show that one to you guys. And yeah, this number is now wrong. It's faster. So we've got 2 goals with PhoneGap, and this is probably the most controversial bit of the project. The first part is that we want the web to be a first-class platform. So that's great. I think everyone here can agree that this internet thing is going to work out for all of us. And we want our kids to have the same internet that we had, and maybe even a better one if we can. And building to proprietary platforms that lock you in and sell you tools is not going to be the solution, not the future that we want. So our second idea is that we want to cease to exist. And so we're building PhoneGap as a reference implementation for web standards. And this is why we're doing this project in the first place. We'd rather be building web apps. PhoneGap's free, so this sometimes confuses people. They're like, oh, it's open source, so what's the catch? There is none. It's free for you to use. We just want people out there using it. It's based on device APIs, which are based on standards. So I talked a little bit about this, but I'm going to talk a little bit more. So we've got different types of device APIs. There's basically 3 buckets. There's sensors, data, and output. So sensors are like your camera, accelerometer, whatever. Data is your file system, your media, your contacts. And then your outputs would be things like your screen or the speakers on the phone. We don't give any access to that, but we have plugins that do. So we're big on the UNIX philosophy. So we advocate freedom of choice for developers, which means we don't dictate what tooling you use, and we also advocate small single-purpose tools. So you don't have to use all of PhoneGap to use it. You can use just the Android part or just the iOS part if you want. We're not here to lock you in, and we don't choose. We also don't dictate tooling for GUI development. This one's been really difficult for a lot of people to swallow. They want us to tell them how to build a web app. But any time that we come out and say, hey, here's how you build a web app, we're basically self-deprecating. This industry moves really fast, and there's no way that we could stay on top of it, and we're solving enough problems as is. Some people like to use things like Sencha. Some people like to use jQuery Mobile. I recommend that people try writing JavaScript. And we don't dictate IDEs either, so we're not interested in that. When we built PhoneGap, so we built this exec bridge thing, right? And so every platform has this thing with this success callback, this fail callback, service action, and arguments. And we use that under the hood. Actually, let me get out of here. Just go to Android because it's what I know best. So we use that under the hood to dynamically invoke the APIs that we call. And when we were building PhoneGap, we realized that we do this the same way all over the place. And unfortunately, all of the developers that were out there started to notice this too. And so we finally, in PhoneGap 2.0, gave people what we were calling a plugin interface or a plugin API. So right now, PhoneGap's really only concerned with device APIs because those are truly cross-platform, and those are things that we can implement on the web. But there's a lot of functionality that are on these native platforms that people want to get access to that we might not necessarily want to participate in. So the first obvious example is native GUIs. So if I look at, just very quickly, I'll show you how a plugin is written. I want to pick something simple. Definitely not the contacts API. This accelerometer is pretty simple. Geolocation would be the simplest, maybe. There it is. So I'll make this a bit smaller. Fucking Java. So every PhoneGap API follows the same thing where it returns a plugin result, which essentially serializes down to JSON. And it's not very complicated at all. So you can call any native code you want in any platform you want. We don't lock you out of that. And recently, well, not even just recently, we just figured this out actually. There's currently 100 community contributed PhoneGap plugins for various platforms. Oh, I might not be on the web totally. Oh, I am. So if I jump into like iOS, These are all plugins. And some of them it just doesn't make sense. Like we wouldn't include, say, in-app purchase manager, but lots of people would want to have the ability in their PhoneGap application to access a revenue model from in-app purchases, so they use that. Our plugins right now are documented, but they're not. We're improving them. So if you want to create a plugin, you can just go to our plugin development guide. And if it was loading, oh, actually I know why. I was running that locally. That's rare. I was running it locally and it didn't work. So in our plugin development guide, it'll teach you how to write a plugin for all these different platforms, and it's also a good way to get ramped up contributing back to PhoneGap yourself. There isn't any functionality that the mobile platform can do that isn't available to you. So I just want that one to sort of sink in. PhoneGap has issues. There's the web versus native debate. You've probably heard of it. There's device browser variants, so this is also an issue, and web development's hard. PhoneGap plugins just make the whole web versus native debate completely moot. You can write web apps, and you can still access any native code. Problem solved. Great. Browser parity, however, is a real issue. I was talking to some guys at the bar last night. Of course, mobile developers are at the bar late. And this is just an actual fact. There's not much we can do for it. Android 2.3 is a crummy browser. Android 4.0 is a slightly better browser, but it's actually slower because now Google's putting all their effort into Chromium. iOS's browser keeps getting faster, but they're kind of letting their web view languish. It doesn't get Nitro, for example. So these browsers are different. They're all WebKit, but they are different. And so you're going to end up having to write cross-browser code. This probably isn't news to a web developer, though. You always had to do it. And grab a drink afterwards. So we have a couple of hosted services. We have this thing called build.phonegap.com. I'm not here to pitch you. I'm just telling you it exists. Build.phonegap.com lets you compile PhoneGap applications using our servers, so you don't have to install these SDKs on your personal machine. It's open source, it's free for open source projects, and it's free for one private project, so that's cool. We have support services, so if you work for a bank, come talk to me. That was maybe not that funny. Or everyone here works for a bank, and they're like, okay. Our first priority, though, or my first priority anyways, is to get people contributing. PhoneGap is a big brute force project, and there's a lot of work that we have to do. So if you're interested in writing mobile code, come talk to me about that. We have a different release philosophy than a lot of open source projects. So we ship on the classic major minor patch, like 2.1.0 or whatever. We generally agree on one goal for every month, and then we ship no matter what at the end of every month. And we prioritize bugs first, and this is actually really good. So when iOS broke local storage in Android or iOS 5.1, we were able to fix it and submit a patch within 2 or 3 days. Apple actually incorporated that same thing into iOS 6. So our cadence is super important. We ship, and we put shipping as the highest priority above putting a feature in a ship date. And I know your marketing department would hate you if you told them that this works, but it does. So we just shipped 2.0, and we shipped it on the date we said we would because we took all the stuff that we had left over and we put it into 2.1. It's software. It's okay. You can ship it a little bit later. Plugins were a big story. Consistent automations around our CLI tooling, which I sort of demoed for you guys earlier. We added Windows Phone support, which is cool. There's a few people here that will be happy to hear that, I guess. We added this thing called Cordova View, which a lot of people are starting to use now. So Cordova View lets you embed PhoneGap inside of a native app or a larger native application. So this is good if you want to either migrate away from PhoneGap or if you want to have a whole bunch of PhoneGap instances in one project. There's a whole bunch of links. I'm going to breeze through our roadmap because I think I'm almost out of time and I want you guys to be able to ask me questions. So big theme for 2013 is developer ergonomics, and one of our developers was joking that we want to be the Herman Miller chair of mobile development, which I thought was sweet. So our CLI tooling right now, you saw at the very beginning of this presentation, I was trying to install the latest build of it. We hope to ship this for 2.2, I think, maybe 2.3, but the idea is that you're going to have this whole set of CLI tooling for doing absolutely everything with PhoneGap, and you'll never have to look at the native code if you don't want to. We're building Winery, which is this remote debugger in, and we've got this Ripple emulator thing from RIM, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a second. So our plugin API is documented. but we haven't completely agreed yet on what plugin packaging looks like. And so when you have a plugin right now, it's kind of a copy-paste job. You got to copy some native files into some different spots, and you got to copy some JavaScript in. It's not super pretty. Once we have a common package format, we'll be able to do automated installation. When you think about it, if you have like a consistent package format, then you can do this copy-paste job really easily. This is, by the way, not just something that we're going to do soon. It's like under heavy active development. It's happening right now. The guys that work on Node.js are actually nice enough to let us use NPM as our prototyping surface. So we're going to have plugin discovery the same way Node has NPM package installation, which is cool. So you'll be able to do things like Cordova plugin install Facebook, and you'll get Facebook sign in your web view and PhoneGap sometime this year. We're now starting to work with the CSS Working Group of all people, the DApp, and of course the widgets and sysapps. I talked a little bit about that. So I explained that how our releases work. This is our schedule for the coming year. So we already shipped 2.1 on the 21st, ironically. 2.2 slated for the end of October, which is well underway. In November, we'll be shipping 2.3. In December, we're going to ship a Unicode snowman. And no one cares. So there's like generally agreed on themes, right? This is an open source project, so like I can't say exact dates because there's no way I can assign bugs to guys that work at different companies. Autumn was all about making 2.0 more solid. Some bugs were discovered when Mountain Lion was released, for example. That was funny. It released, and some guy like posted to the PhoneGap issue tracker that Mountain Lion broke amateur hour, and we're like, Mountain Lion shipped an hour ago. Like, come on. So we have Firefox OS prototype. Google's helping us speed up PhoneGap Android. You can check out their work. It's crazy. They're doing a whole bunch of prototyping. Ripple is an emulator from RIM. And you'll have to Google it to check it out. But basically, it puts a PhoneGap environment in your browser, which is nice. And we're going to start making it a part of the PhoneGap project proper. We have this thing called the config XML, which is from the widget packaging spec. It's where you put a bunch of manifest data. So you say things like what features you want enabled, what your app title is, that kind of junk. Right now, there hasn't been parity across all the platforms, and we're finishing that. There used to be a really popular plugin called the child browser plugin, but then there was a bunch of pedophile jokes. So we renamed it to in-app browser to stop that, and we're adding it to the PhoneGap platform. Which is great. It's going to have the declarative and imperative APIs, so you can do things like window.open, and it'll spawn a browser window inside of your PhoneGap application. The MasterScript CLI tooling, it's underway, like I said, working with Node. The winter, we think we'll have plugins done. So I'm probably going to regret saying that. Ripple, so this device emulator that we have, is pretty good. So it lets you create a PhoneGap environment instead of Chrome, but there's still problems with it. And namely, you can't get any device APIs out of your browser, so you end up having to fake them. So if you take a picture, we just put a fake picture in. We figure, since this thing is written in Node, why not just put a socket in there and allow a phone to connect to it so that we can pipe device events from the phone into the browser. So sometime in the winter, we're going to have this capability. We actually have a prototype of this already, and it's pretty sweet. When you move your phone, it'll pipe the events straight into your web browser, so then you don't have to like goof around with testing just on your device. You can do all your development on your computer using refresh and still get all the same behavior that you'd get on a phone. We talked to Zynga about HTML5 audio. They told us it was fucked. So we said, all right, we'll unfuck it. And we're going to do that. We're still going through all of our APIs, so a lot of stuff is changing because the standards are changing. And we had the goal of graduating to a top-level project from Apache by the winter. We actually just shipped our first official Apache release, so hopefully it'll be even sooner, maybe even this fall. The springtime, we're going to continue migrating our APIs to the new stuff that's coming out of the standards. We figure sysapps group will be well underway by then. We're going to be adding a notification center plugin to a core part of the platform. Urban Airship is probably going to work with us on that and offer it as a service if you want to use them, but you can set up your own server. Right now, we need native pickers for all of our different things. So if you want to create your own contacts list in PhoneGap, you have to render all those contacts in the DOM. And that's expensive, time-consuming, and slow. So we're going to have input type equals contacts, and that will invoke a native picker for that. Just makes sense. We have all these awesome contributors. These are our goals. Boom. That's all I got for you guys. I don't know, do we have time for questions? So how big of a problem is browser fragmentation? It's kind of ugly. Like, so if you're getting involved in doing basically iOS and Android, it's pretty seamless, and BlackBerry. When you throw Windows Phone into the mix, things get a little grosser. So Windows Phone doesn't have touch events. Bizarrely, it has one of the fastest Canvas implementations. So Windows Phone is really good at some things and just really annoyingly bad at others. We're trying to polyfill that touch event problem for the next release of PhoneGap, but yeah, I mean, it's browser-based development. You're going to have conditional code. You're also going to have situations where you're going to want to do stuff like, in Android, you don't want to put the tab bar on the bottom because they have the virtual and/or physical hardware buttons at the bottom. So you always want to put a tab bar at the top in Android. Sometimes people are like, oh, well, then you're forking your code. And it's like, yeah, I guess you have like slightly different CSS for two platforms, but it's not that bad. Did that answer your question? Yeah, cool. Any other questions? I'll be here for the next few days if you guys want to find me. I'm approachable.